Biology is one of the greatest tools that humans have ever developed for understanding the human function. What happens in the body, how the body works, how do we change it? But something it doesn't do is tell us about the human condition, nor does it prescribe how we should run our societies. But simply, that's not what it's for. So why do we act like it is? Genetics has been used to argue that a race is superior to all others. Medicine has been used to argue that homosexuality was a disease that needed to be cured. And the topic that I'll be talking about today, the presence or absence of a Y chromosome determines what gender role a person will take in their lifetime. And how do we combat these claims? Ms. Fanon Mendez, the chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, said in a UN event that the hierarchy of race is scientifically false, morally condemnable, and socially unjust. Scientifically false. A study back in 2005 from the Dean Hamer's Laboratory searched for genetic factors that influence male homosexuality. And as for trans rights, Dr. Anne Fausto Sterling notes that the judge who initially ruled the case of Maya Forstater versus Center for Global Development states that morphology is not simply a question of what genes a person has, but also of which ones are being switched on, to what extent, in what combinations, and how they interact. For those like me who didn't know, this is the case that J.K. Rowling was speaking about when they said #I stand with Maya. So this appeal to science was not the primary reason that the judge ruled against Forstater, but this argument, coming from a biological perspective, is not the right approach for advocating for the right of trans and gender diverse folks. In this video, I will dissect the biological argument, try my best to portray what both sides are saying, but I will ultimately show that this approach is nonsensical when considering trans rights. I will go into some of the details of the biology, with the assumption that you know next to nothing about genetics. I will provide my perspective and opinion both as a graduate in biomedical sciences and as a person who aligns myself with the rights of trans and gender diverse people. But I'm also very critical of science and what some people may call the politicization of science. I prefer to call it the weaponization of science. So to make sure that we're on the same page, I want to talk about what genes are and what they're not. So I will address some potential misconceptions or incomplete ideas about genes. Starting with, number 1, genes encode your traits such as hair color, height, eye color, etc. So a gene is a string of code that gives instructions on how to make a protein. And this protein is what does work in the body. Hair color, for example, is determined by the body's ability to make the pigment melanin, but the genes don't encode for melanin. Instead, they encode for a protein that helps make melanin. If you can stop the protein from working, it won't matter what genes you have. You won't make melanin changing your hair. And this is what happens when we age. We still have the same genes, but they're not functioning the same way. Number 2, one gene encodes for one trait. So there's a gene for hair color, there's a gene for height, and there's a gene for homosexuality. Again, genes encode proteins, which are what do work. And these proteins are specialized to do their particular job. They're not going to change midway unless that's part of their job description. And these proteins, they work at a cellular level. And there are 30 trillion cells in a human body. The jobs that protein do are often mundane, such as moving a cell or making sure a cell doesn't move, or turning one chemical into another chemical that would be passed around like a hot potato to make a different chemical altogether. Your traits come about by an interplay of several genes and the environment. Saying that one gene encodes one trait is saying that one person is responsible for the rise or fall of the tech center stocks. It's never just one person, and it's never just one gene. Number 3, the collection of your genes will determine your traits or how you express. So there's a saying in biology that your phenotype is determined by your genotype and the environment. A phenotype is just any observable characteristic of a living thing. So your traits. And the genotype is the collection of your genes. So in saying that a phenotype is determined by your genotype and the environment, we're saying that your genes and the environment, that they act in will determine your traits. And with these misconceptions about genes out of the way, we can move on to analyzing these arguments based off biological science. So I'm sure you've heard this idea before, that there are only two sexes, male and female. See this tweet by Mary Forstater. Sex is a biological fact and is immutable. Men are male, women are female. It is impossible to change sex. These were until very recently understood as basic facts of life. And sex is a biological immutable condition determined by reproductive biology. So in this case, reproductive biology refers to your genes, and this is where we'll get to the biology of it. The collection of all of your genes is called your genome, and your genome is split into separate chunks called chromosomes, with 46 chromosomes total. 23 of these chromosomes come from one female parent, and 23 come from one male parent. So you can think of your genome like a book, with each chromosome being different chapters. Now what we're interested in is this last one here. It says XY. What we see here is that more than likely, this person will be male because they have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. Females are XX, males are XY. Of course, this means that sex will be passed along by the male. And this is because a female can only pass along an X, while the male can either pass along one X or one Y. The Y chromosome is smaller, but it's what a person needs to be male. The X chromosome, on the other hand, is bigger, and it also plays a much bigger role in developing in the womb. Just for some comparisons, there are some people who only have one X chromosome and no Y chromosomes, and they can survive. These people are female. And there are no people who have no X chromosome, but one Y chromosome. A mistaken transfer of genes will sometimes cause 3 X chromosomes, leading to a female fetus. And there are some who will have one X and 2 Ys, or 2 X and 1 Y, and either one will lead to a male fetus. So this there are two sexes argument amounts to 1. The presence of a Y chromosome will largely determine who will develop into male and who will develop into female. 2. The definition of a woman is an adult human female, and the definition of a man is an adult human male. 3. You cannot change your genes, and even if you could, if you've already developed into a male or female, the process won't reverse. And 4. Therefore, your genes determines if you're a man or if you are a woman. And I'm sure you're ready to tear this apart, but tell me, if you were going to tear apart, which part of the argument seems the weakest? I would argue it's probably number 2. So why is it that we're trying to appeal to number 1? To address the biological issues of gender? Let's look back to what the judge said about the matter. Morphology is not simply a question of what genes a person has, but also of which ones are being switched on, to what extent, in what combinations, and how they interact. This is the same idea as we've previously talked about, the phenotype. And morphology is just a part of the phenotype concerned with the size and shape of the body. So, the phenotype is determined by your genotype and the environment, which is what determines what conditions they interact in. So when arguing for this idea, the judge is appealing to the fact that sometimes people who have the Y chromosome in their genome sometimes don't develop into males, and people who have no Y chromosome will sometimes develop into females. But how is this? Recall earlier that I said that X chromosome plays a large role in the survival and development of a human, while the Y chromosome plays a role in determining whether the growing fetus will be a male or not. And this isn't by magic. This shouldn't be mystifying or intimidating. So let's shine some light on this. In the womb, all fetuses start developing with genes from the X chromosome, which is in charge of developing female genitalia. However, about 6 to 7 weeks of development, the genes in the Y chromosome will turn on if they have one, and the development of this female genitalia will become male genitalia. The ovaries will become testes, the labia will close and fuse up to become the scrotum, and the clitoris will enlarge to become the glands of the penis. For some people with the Y chromosome, the gene in the Y chromosome doesn't get activated, which leads to the continued development of female genitalia. This is what happens in the case of total androgen insensitivity syndrome. A person who is XY will develop with female genitals and undergo female puberty since their bodies don't respond to the male sex hormone, telling them otherwise. But this insensitivity comes in a spectrum. Sometimes a person who has the XY chromosome may be only partially receptive to the male sex hormone. So we see how the developing genitalia becomes a male or female genitalia because of the activation of male genes. But what if there was only a partial activation of these genes? We might get something that looks more like these kinds of genitals. We see genitals that develop differently, and that we can't definitively classify into the binary. And that puberty for these individuals, they're also going to develop differently. And we start to see where this biological appeal comes from. And so the argument against the idea of only two sexes goes as follows. 1. The presence of the Y chromosome does not track, by itself, the development into male or female genitalia. 2. There can be a spectrum in the expression of male or female characteristics. And 3. Therefore, genes cannot be the sole arbiter in the matter of sex. And this argument tracks somewhat. But it's so woefully lacking in the fight for trans and gender diverse rights. Notice the conclusion. From the premises, our best conclusion can only be that genes are not enough. And this is part of the reasoning that the judge gave in their ruling. I read through some of their arguments about science, and they spoke a lot about genetics, and about the things that we talked about here, and how chromosomes may differ, leading to different expression. But the best we can do is say that genes are not enough. There's nothing about how we can determine gender. And included in the judge's rulings, Dr. Diana Adkins provided information about what we talked about here, about the different expression with different chromosomes. But they also note that these variations are rare, and they themselves do not accept the concept of gender identity. So why do we need to shift the conversation away from science and biology? Dr. Anna Fausto-Sterling, the Nancy Duke Lewis Professor of Biology and Gender Studies at Brown University, wrote an article in the Boston Review. Science won't settle trans rights. I wanted to do a video on specifically this topic, and imagine my pleasant surprise when I found out that someone way more qualified than I am already spoke about this. But here, she writes, "It is easy to understand why people turn to biology to settle disputes about the LGBTQ rights. In legal arguments, advocates often use the idea that rights accrue because a particular trait is biologically immutable. It is a tactical and legal mistake," Feldblum contends, "to argue that minority populations be treated fairly because they cannot change who they are." But of course, it's not enough for us to say that we have to move away from science in the issue and appeal to the ideas of people more qualified. We have to understand why it's in our best interest to move away from this. I want to share an anecdote about a conversation I had with someone in my program. This person had a solid understanding of genetics and how sex expression develops. They told me that they don't believe in the idea that someone can identify as a different gender, since it's so easily encoded. And of course, me, knowing this argument against the two sexes, brings up the idea of total androgen insensitivity syndrome. And the other person just replies, "Well, yeah, but I'm not talking about those super rare edge cases." And I allowed them to continue. I didn't have another response. So we can't trap ourselves in keeping the conversation where the authority can come from grade school education. And of course, we don't. But making claims about science denial distracts us from what we truly want to bring about this into society, and why. We want to acknowledge that we as a society have created gender roles that, while previously was defined as based along the lines of biological sex expression, we have since moved on to include people who take on gender roles on the opposite side of, or in between of, or out of. Science was never meant to give us an answer to this. Biology doesn't say who uses which bathroom. Genetics does not say that a person with male genitalia is and always will be a he, him. And most importantly, our genes do not tell us why we should respect the inherent dignity of people. We do.